Welcome to the Long Thread podcast about spinning, stitching, and weaving by hand. The podcast is presented by Long Thread Media, publishers of Spin-Off, Handwoven, Piecework, and Little Looms magazines. Find us online at longthreadmedia.com. Trinway Silks is where weavers, spinners, knitters, and stitchers find the silk they love. Select from the largest variety of silk spinning fibers, silk yarn, and silk threads and ribbons at trinwaysilks.com. You'll discover a rainbow of colors thoughtfully hand-dyed in Colorado. Love natural? Trinway's array of wild silks provide choices beyond white. If you love silk, you'll love Trinway Silks, where superior quality and customer service are guaranteed. Knitpicks.com has been serving the knitting community for over 20 years and believes knitting is for everyone, which is why they work hard to make knitting accessible, affordable, and approachable. Knitpicks responsibly sources its fiber to create an extensive selection of affordable yarns like High Desert from Shaniko Wool Company. Are you looking for an ethical, eco-friendly yarn to try? Look no further than Knitpicks Eco Yarn line. Need needles? Knitpicks makes a selection for knitters right at their Vancouver, Washington headquarters. Knitpicks.com, a place for every knitter. I'm your host, Long Thread Media co-founder Anne Marrow. Emily Lymm is the dyer behind the naturally dyed yarn company Wool and Palette, based in Portland, Oregon. So Emily, thanks so much for being here.
I'm so excited to be here. Thank you for asking me.
It's my pleasure. So I was going to ask you about your company, Wool and Palette. And would you say that you're like a natural dyer or a natural dye company? How would you describe what you do?
Well, I'm a natural dyer, singular, and it would be great to grow, to make this bigger. I guess right now this is my 4th year in existence, and I'm working on becoming more of a production dyer, really trying to focus on how to make more and more efficiently with one person. So just me for right now.
So part of the reason I asked that question is that, when I look at your website, your sort of background in design and emphasis on repeatability and things like that, it can be hard to tell, like, this is the vision of one person, but at the same time, you are bringing this sort of consistency of vision and brand that I often think of as something that you see in larger yarn companies. So I guess that's part of why I was asking, is there really only one person behind the curtain?
Thank you so much. That's so kind. Well, I guess I can back up a little bit. I graduated with a degree in graphic design from Western Michigan University and then moved out to Portland, Oregon after I graduated. And I spent my next 16 years just graphic designing, working in design agencies, big corporations, small marketing firms. So kind of all over the place. And so I understand branding, the photography, the logos, all of that stuff. That is what my past is steeped in. And so it was really exciting to be able to take those skills and apply them to the small business that I've created. And so I guess now I've been a designer for 20 years because I graduated college that long ago already. And I love using those skills. I have to say, if you're going to go into business, one of the most useful things you can have is graphic design because you just use it so like every single day, knowing those programs, knowing how to pull it all together. So it probably looks like I'm larger because I know how to get it to look that way, but it's still just me.
Well, one of the elements of if you've ever had to try to direct a graphic designer is designers are some ways in like this gap between I can't put my finger on it, I see it, but I can't explain it. And so being able to translate an idea into something visual that you respond to with your gut, even if you can't explain it with your words. So
yeah, that's a really good point. Like that's a skill you develop over years and years with working with clients. And they'll say, I know what it is I want, but I can't explain it. And so it is your job to decipher that feeling. And it may take multiple rounds of pulling it out of them. And then finally they'll start to see something. Or I'll be like, what is it you're envisioning? Do you have just something you can show me real quick? And then I can disseminate from your visual cue. So it's kind of like a push-pull getting someone to that point where they're finally seeing it, what they've seen in their head. So yeah, that's a skill you develop over years and years of just knowing that's a process. But when I started, I kind of knew exactly what I wanted my logo to look like. Like I knew the feeling I wanted to invoke. And I did like a pretty robust analysis, like a competitive analysis at the very beginning. And I just tried to see everything that was out there in the yarn dyeing world, natural dyers. I had all of the Excel spreadsheets and I was going back and forth and seeing how everyone else was representing themselves. And once I started to see the sea of everything out there, I was like, oh, okay, I can kind of see where I fit. I can see where my brand is going to be able to go, this little vein that I can plot myself into. Yeah. So that was nice. And the funny thing was, the last project I worked on prior to leaving my job, I had just done a branding exercise for a company, and we bought this really fancy font from like a fancy type foundry, and I was in love with this font, and it was expensive. And I was like, well, I own it now. And I'm using this font for myself. So I kind of,
Ah,
saved a little bit of time right there. I did a lot of research finding that font, but it was like, that was kind of a nice little perk.
it's a totally different kind of foraging.
Yeah, I spent a lot of time researching typefaces and trying to tell clients this is the one you need, and they'd be like, "Well, this one's cheaper." I'm like, "Yeah, but this one's a little better over here."
Yeah, that and explaining the intangibles is such a challenge. So, but did you know that you wanted your journey to your having your own business be through a dye pot, or was it something where you said, "I just love to play with color. Let me find something to
Yeah,
a way to do that"?
I think when I first started learning how to knit, it was about like 15 years ago, everybody that learns, they're probably like, "Oh, I should turn this into a business. This is great." And then I think I remembered Googling how to make a living knitting. And the answer on the internet was quite bleak. And it didn't look like it was going to be a reality. So I was like, well, maybe I shouldn't quit my day job. But I kept graphic designing, and
Mhm.
every once in a while, I would kind of check myself and be like, is this a possibility to do something with it? And then I remember writing, this is random. I can't believe I'm going down this little path, writing down one day at work, like a 5-year plan, right? You just get these moments of inspiration. What do I want my life to look like in 5 years? And one of the thing was start a career in fiber arts. Not that it would ever be obtained, but I guess at that point I was on Instagram and I had a couple yarn dyers I was following, and I was like, this seems like a thing that people do. I mean, they're still doing it. They must be making a living, right? So I kind of got stuck in the back of my head.
Yeah.
And then one day I went to the bookstore at lunchtime and I found Fiber Shed, that awesome book from Rebecca Burgess. And then I bought like a yarn dyeing book. Then I found her Gathering Colors book, which is all about natural dyeing. And I flipped that puppy open. I was like, what? This is a thing? People can naturally dye yarn and go forage for it. I like could think of nothing else after I opened that book. And I read through both of them and I was just like astonished at how it blew my mind open, and everything that was coexisting that I wasn't taking part in. And I instantly wanted to be a part of it.
So it was kind of a wanting to be part of the fiber arts, but also I think that my impression is that that was very much in line with your values, that you have a strong value around working collaboratively with the planet and kind of combining good design with good stewardship.
Absolutely. You hit the nail on the head. And at the time, I had a great job at a design agency, and we had a lot of really large global clients. And I found this like cognitive dissonance between the things that I was creating every day for people and what my heart really wanted to do. What my heart wanted to do was be a part of the solution and help global climate change in any way that I could, and you read through Fiber Shed and you read the facts, and the trends and what the textile world is turning into. It's just like everything's loaded in plastic and unhealthy dyes and all of that stuff, and what we're doing to the planet when we shouldn't be doing. So that stuff was really tugging at my heartstrings, and I could start, like, my heart would race when I was reading through it. And I was like, there has to be something I could do and put my talents to use in this way, instead of selling really fancy overpriced items for large corporations, which, that's what pays the bills. So there was definitely, I would go to work, be loving my job, but feeling really torn between what I was helping sell and what I wanted to do.
And now a word from our sponsors. The Adirondack Wool and Arts Festival is the perfect way to spend a weekend surrounded by over 150 craft vendors in Greenwich, New York. Discover a curated group of vendors featuring the best of wool and artisan crafters. Throughout the weekend, enjoy workshops, free horse-drawn wagon rides, free kids' crafts, a fiber sheep show, and a sanctioned cashmere goat show. Join us September 21st and 22nd, 2024, and every fall. For more information, visit adkwoolandarts.com. That's adkwoolandarts.com. And now back to the show. So, did you start by teaching yourself how to use natural dyes for your own yarn and then go from there?
Yeah, I just decided, okay, I had this book. I found out about Aurora Silk, who was local to me, and because she sells madder root. She sells tons of things, but it was in the Gathering colors. So I decided to buy that, and I bought some yarn, and I decided I'm gonna start dyeing it. I'm gonna have this business, and I kind of just, I haven't done this in a long time, but those moments where you're so sure of something and you just dive in, you just commit to it. And I just had that moment where, like, my body in middle age needed to do something different, and I dove in. I was like, I'm doing this. I'm making it work. Went and bought the equipment.
So you did not test your way into this. It was like,
no.
Yeah. So what were your first experiments like? Did they come out like you were expecting?
Well, I followed the recipe to a T. So they did. They turned out pretty well. And then the more riskier you're feeling, I would try new things. And of course, the results are all over the map. It takes a really long time to get good at it. But because I wanted to be good right away, as we all do.
Yeah.
I just dove in and I dyed batch after batch after batch, and I would follow the recipes, and then I would try to veer off a little bit and try something different after I was starting to feel kind of confident in my results. And then you realize how much you don't know, and then your world really opens up. Have you heard of that curve where you learn something immediately and then you feel like you're an expert, and then the more you feel, then the curve drops dramatically and you realize how much you don't know, and then you kind of slowly work your way back up. So I think I'm in the slowly working my way back up after about 4 years.
I think that's the Dunning-Kruger effect. I think that's the...
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That sounds right. Mm-hmm.
And yes, it's like knowing enough to know that you know nothing. It's kind of scary. So did you start dyeing for a knitter like you?
I suppose I did. I didn't really know who I was doing it for, right? Like, that's something that comes a little bit later once you understand consumers, ideal customers. But I just knew I wanted to do the thing. I wanted to make yarn a certain color. And then I realized, after I had initially made a purchase with a large undyed yarn company, that it was actually the beginning of COVID, and there wasn't a lot of non-superwash options out there. I couldn't get a whole family of non-superwash wool, and that was frustrating. So I started just Googling Oregon Sheep Association, Growers Association, because I was like, there's got to be someone close by, right, that I can get yarn from. And I just started cold calling people off that list. And anytime I found a sheep breed that I thought sounded like it would be good for, like, close to skin, anything like Columbia to Rambouillet to Merino, I would leave a message, and within 30 minutes, Jeanne Carver of Shaniko Wool Company called me back.
I was going to say, first of all, you could not pick a better state to be in looking for, Columbia, but for wool. And also, boy, it sounds like she was just down the other end of the state doing exactly what you were looking for.
Yeah, Maupin, Oregon is just like 2.5 to 3 hours from here. And just the fact that she called me back so quickly. And Jeannie, she is just so inspiring and magnetic and full of energy. And she just started talking about her wool and the way that they foster their land and treat their animals, and everything about what she was doing and she believed in was everything I was looking for. And I thought, how on earth did this just happen? How did this fall into my lap? And it was a really pivotal conversation. And I was like, this is what I'm doing. Yes, use the natural dyes and use this local to me, non-superwash, untreated wool. This is the dream. This is exactly what I wanted. I wanted the full picture. I wanted it all come together to make the most sustainable yarn I possibly could.
Yeah. And one of the interesting things about Shaniko is that, you can also get it as superwash treated because they're kind of on a mission to have this wool be for every purpose. But if what you were looking for was something that was soft and took dye beautifully and also was non-superwash, which I think a lot of people are looking for now.
Yeah. And I think at the time it was starting to become a thing. Now, 4 years later, it's all over the place. People are constantly looking for non-superwash. There's a lot more options out there than there were initially. So I had to really dig for it. And I was lucky to have found it as quickly as I did. I did do the route at the beginning where I went to a farm and I grabbed a fleece and I washed it myself and I sent it off to a small mill where you pack it down into the USPS box as tightly as you can to get all the air out. And then they, and you specify what you want and then you get it back. And I was like, that was a really fun process. Honestly, I enjoyed washing the wool. I liked picking it out. And my husband was really like, hey, you should try all parts of the process to see what you like. What if you end up doing a thing that you hate? Don't, so I was excited to have tried it. And then I crunched the numbers and I was like, honestly, the shipping back and forth, that added a lot of expense. So I was like, that's when I went back to Google and I was like, okay, maybe I need to source something from a place that's already taken care of. And when I talked to Jeanne, she was like, well, we already have this, everything is set up and it's already, you can get it straight from the mill. And I was like, whoa, that's kind of what I need at this point.
Yeah, I think that's important, the shipping element of it. And that's part of the reason why I think my colleague Kate Larson tells me that it's part of the reason why a lot of shepherds don't have their wool milled. It seems like, oh, they don't know what they have. Well, they know how much it costs to ship it back and forth. And so that's not necessarily that there's gold just waiting to be picked up. It's that the economics are complicated.
It's a huge consideration of the product chain. And if you are fortunate enough to live close to a mill where you can just load it all up and drive it there yourself and drop it off, that's great. But on the West Coast, there just aren't as many mills as there used to be. It used to be a mecca of wool production out here. And it seems like the East Coast has a lot more resources. So I was just fishing around and trying to find what I could. And even if you can find something, the mills that are up in operation again are kind of specialized and small. So, the prices weren't as competitive as I was looking for. But luckily, that supply chain had been figured out for me. And I'm really happy that everything stays within the United States. It's not crossing borders. It's not shipping too many times. So there's trade-offs trying to figure out, okay, I want it to be homegrown farm yarn. That would be great if I had the sheep and I had the land. But, you just have to figure out what's going to work for your product.
Right. Well, and having some consistency in the yarn that you're going to dye. But the other element of it is when you're thinking about natural dyes and natural dye stuffs. What a layer of inconsistency there can be in there. Are you out growing your own dye stuff and trying to make sure that you have the same colors every year? Are you finding a trusted supplier? Are you a gardener as well as a dyer?
Great question. All of the above. Yes. Of course, when I first dove into this, I immediately started digging up my backyard so I could have a huge dye garden. And they're substantial rows for my city backyard. And at first, I tried everything. I think I had 10 different dye plants back there. And any blog on the internet that said a plant could produce a color, I was trying to grow that plant. And then after a year or so, and then experimenting with it, you realize this is a hard plant to grow, or it doesn't really give very color fast results. So I got better at picking the plants. I still have a large garden, but you need a lot of material to create really great color. So of course I started sourcing from natural dyer suppliers. So I do a combination, and the flowers, there's only so many flowers I can grow. So I collect those, and every once in a while I'll do a batch with them. But mostly I'm focusing on saving those for natural dye kits and plants like weld that it grows. You can make rows and rows and rows of it, and it creates these beautiful 7 to 8 foot stalks and really consistent yellow color. That is a workhorse plant that I can fill my yard with. And I use that a lot to over dye with blues, like with indigo and with logwood, and I get really great greens. So that's a really tried and true plant that I'm always going to keep growing. I have a couple rows of batter root, which you can only harvest every 3 years. So that's a time commitment. But otherwise, I do source from natural dyer suppliers.
Anything where you're growing something agriculturally, I would imagine that the consistency is pretty difficult. So when you were talking about growing your garden, my first thought was, what are you going to do in December?
Yeah, it gets pretty sparse out there.
Yeah.
There is one flower that's really interesting. It's called Black Knight Scabiosa, otherwise known as pincushion, and it's an anthocyanide dye. So the flower is dark, dark purple, almost black. And when you dye with it, it will create a kind of like a sea foamy aqua color. And it's the second dye will make more of a steely blue. And it's beautiful. And anthocyanide, they tend to fade over time. They'll still keep their color, but they won't be as intense at first as they are at first. And those will stay blooming for like 10 months. So I just plant as many as I can. I keep clipping the flowers, clipping the stems so that the energy will go back into the plant and they'll create more blooms. And I'll plant those in the spring, and I can continue to harvest those up until probably November, which is really cool. And then the weld, once you harvest that, it keeps these little rosettes. So they're short little plants, so your garden still looks like there's something going on. It's still green. It's just short.
Winter interest is what they tell me. Winter interest.
Yeah. And I mean, it's Portland, so it will snow once or twice, but it's pretty moderate weather here, and it's very rainy. So your garden will still kind of look kind of okay. It doesn't completely die back.
So when you go out for a dye day, are you typically creating one color, two colors? How are you deciding what to do?
Oh, yeah. I used to try a couple things at once. Back in the beginning, I started from my stove, and then I graduated to cooktops in my breezeway, and I had to plug things into the garage, in through my bathroom window, and then in through the kitchen because there wasn't enough electricity to get out to the garage because it was so out of date. And then now ended up having to redo the garage, and I have an electrical box for the garage. So it looks more like a studio now. So it's definitely more production ready. And in that same vein, I've become more efficient, and I try to do one color at a time. So I've got 10 pots. I've got 5 burners, and I will work on doing about 40 skeins at a time now, but in one color. So I'll scour and mordant the yarn, and it's usually I'm occupying 8 pots. So that's 40 skeins, 5 skeins per pot, and they're 5-gallon pots. So I'm doing the immersion dyeing process. Yeah, so it fills up the side of the garage, and I just focus on getting everything really consistent and getting the color that I want and trying to get as many done at one time. And I found that right now is my limit per week. So it usually takes 1 to 2 weeks to get 40 skeins done.
Wow. And 40 skeins sounds like a lot, but I'm assuming that's at 10 pounds. They're 4-ounce skeins.
Yes, they're all 100-gram skeins. So yeah, as a natural dyer, I worked my way up to that and I decided this summer I'm going to go for that. And I'm like, I can do that. It's a lot of logistics, it's a lot of planning, a lot of heavy lifting. That compared to like a traditional acid dyer, indie dyer, I think they can usually do, if they have the right setup and the right amount of pans and like one of those heaters, can probably do about 200 skeins a week. So you can see the difference in production level and efficiency between an acid dyer and a natural dyer. So if I were to go more than 40 skeins, I would definitely need more pans, more burners, more space, but probably another person because I feel like 40 is a max for my body and my back.
Yeah. And 40 skeins, I mean, I have sweaters that take me 10 skeins. That would be fully 25% of your weekly output for me to make a
Oh,
sweater.
yeah. Yes.
Wow.
Yeah. So what I try to do is do like 10 skeins of fingering, 10 skeins of sport, 10 of worsted, 10 of DK. But sometimes I'll decide to do 20 of one way. Just depends on what event I'm getting ready for and what I foresee people wanting.
So where are people finding you? You mentioned events. I certainly know you through your website, but how are people
Yeah.
finding your yarn?
So actually, people are finding me on Google pretty well.
Hmm.
So I have a website and I did try a tiny bit of consignment at the very beginning, but I found that incredibly stressful. So I do trunk shows and fiber festivals. And it's funny because January, Emily decided to sign up for a lot of things this fall. And summer, Emily is like, what were you doing back then, January, Emily? So this fall, I will be at Starlight Knitting's camp, and then I'll be in Bend, Oregon for a traveling trunk show. And this will be my third time doing that. And I love going there. I set up at Fancy Work in Bend. And then I will be vending at Sacred Sheep in November. And that is a huge deal because that's a really big festival. I've done the Rose City Yarn Crawl 3 years and lots of trunk shows. And I even did like a unique markets. I don't know if you've heard of those. They're big in LA and Portland. That was my first market. So I try to do at least 3 a year.
Wow. It's just all of the different hats. You've got gardener, you've got
Yeah.
dyer, you've got
Graphic
designer,
designer and business owner. Yeah.
and also,
So,
shop. I don't know how you describe what merchandising that. Yeah.
oh yeah,
Yeah.
retail hat, right?
Yeah.
I am lucky because about 15 years ago, I was contracting at Nike for the retail merchandising team. I was graphic designing for them, and I was able to pick up a lot of retail tidbits about how they display their seasonal displays. And as a graphic designer, worked on a lot of window designs to take the big concept and push it out to all of like the smaller store windows and setups. So I'm not brand new to retail. So when it came to that and setting up for a market, I mean, it took some research to figure out how to fill a 10 by 10 space, but those were great little tidbits of information I was able to pull in and use in this business.
So what do you learn from your customers when you go to these various trunk shows and events? Like, I assume it must be kind of fun to get to talk to people who are picking up a skein and probably, I would imagine, can't imagine this is natural dyed.
That is such a good question. I learn something at every event. And this is so fascinating to me, like the psychology of the people buying from you. And it depends on so many things. It depends on what time of year it is, how big the event is, what the location is. When I go to Bend, Oregon, that is a vacation town. People come to the yarn store to buy vacation yarn, right? They want something special and different, and they're picking it up, and they have a little bit more budget because they're like, I've saved this up for my vacation. Whereas opposed to like a holiday market, your price point is probably going to be lower because the all of the vendors around you, people are shopping for gifts for someone else usually, and their budget's a little lower because everything around you is different. So, like having small kits of smaller amounts is a good idea. The natural dye kits do a little bit better there because that's like a gift to give to someone else. And then something like the Rose City Yarn Crawl, which is huge, and people are traveling from shop to shop for multiple days. It gets so overwhelming. So, if you can pull an idea together and have like a one skein project and a pattern or a kit, that's really helpful to help with like the overwhelm. So, just understand that every scenario has a different shopper and a different budget and a different purpose. And it took me a couple years to pick up enough information to understand I need to prepare for every single one a little differently.
But do you find that people are surprised that they can just buy naturally dyed yarn, or that what they're seeing that you've made has been created with natural dyes?
Oh, yeah, that is a lovely response from people. They'll walk by and they'll be like, whoa, this was all naturally dyed because I'll kind of have a good amount of colors. And I really specialize on getting very saturated colors, deep. And I also like to make a palette so they all go together nicely. And there are not too many choices. There's just enough color choices to entice. And then hopefully they can find something that they see themselves wearing. But yes, from the general public, usually like the holiday markets, people are just enamored that everything is dyed with natural dyes. So that's a fun response to get. And a lot of the response I get is, I can't believe how dark your colors are. And then I get to talk about, I use a lot of material, or I spend a lot of time trying to extract this certain color to get this certain hue.
Because I've seen that you have some blues that are so dark blue. I mean, that's got to be so
Yeah.
much work. You got to wring all that indigo out.
Well, I have found a different way, not just using indigo. So, one of my favorite dyes to use is logwood. And I've done a little bit more research on logwood and the history of logwood. And it is known for, I guess I didn't realize this at first, it is known to be a color that can fade. But if you prepare it correctly and you use a very solid mordanting process, it can make the color very stable and last for years and years and years. So at first I was dyeing with logwood, and logwood will give you purple right off the bat over alum, but it was sloughing off on people's hands.
Mm.
And that was kind of like a nightmare, when you're finding out people are getting it on their hands and you feel like you have failed and you've made like a not a superior quality product. So I kind of put that to the side and I was like, I'm not dyeing with logwood anymore. It's just too problematic. I don't want unhappy customers. But then I kept reading about it and realized, well, you can make a lot of color with this one material because it's pH sensitive. So I found if you first mordant with copper, very small amount of copper, I do a long mordant period, cold mordanting for like a week. It really binds the fiber, and then I dye logwood over it. It will make a super intense dark navy color.
Wow.
And it's really vibrant,
Hmm.
very vibrant, deep blue color. And then if you over dye yellow on top of that, it makes it an intense dark green, like a pine foresty, almost black. It's like a greenish black. It's really beautiful. But you can also do other things like you can do iron and logwood, and that will give you a navy blue. You can do logwood and then over dye it with iron after, and you can get like dark steely grays. There's so much you can do with logwood. And a logwood was one of those like original colors you could get black with if you overlaid iron, logwood, iron, logwood. But I found that with the wool I use, it was making it really brittle. So
That makes sense. It's interesting. A lot of folks are not comfortable using copper as a mordant these days.
I know it's really mixed depending on who you talk to, because in high amounts, copper is toxic to aquatic life. But in low amounts, it's actually what is used to help with algae blooms.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
And you can also get the same results with using a copper pot. And there's copper pipes that are in a lot of people's homes. So there is an allowance for copper. It's small. So when I use copper, that's why I try to not use it with heat. And I use as small a percentage as I possibly can. And then I also make sure to dump it down the sink where it will go through a filtration system. You never want to dump it into like a sewer drain because then it won't get treated. And that is where it can have an adverse effect on environments. So, yeah, it's probably a little, depending on who you talk to, some people are fine with it. Some people are like, yeesh. So, yeah, I'm interested in chemistry because I really want to know how much of effect it's having. And we're putting a lot of emphasis on this one material, but honestly, if we looked at all of the azo acid dyes that we're using and all of the effects that are running into the water systems there, I mean, which is worse?
Right.
I don't know enough, and
Mhm.
I want to know more. I would love to take the Amewa class. I guess there's this 12-week intensive natural dye class where you really learn tons of chemistry, the why behind everything. I want to do that. And I have a friend who's a natural dyer here in Portland, and she has a biology and organic chemistry background, and she took that class and she was like, "Whoa, this was a lot." And I'm like, "I want to know. I want to know all that."
Yeah, yeah.
So I can actually talk about this in an educated way.
Well, it's interesting that, you were talking about the historical use of logwood and the way that these materials have roots. It also has
Yeah.
roots, but there's a history of use all around the world and different ways that people have been coaxing these colors from these natural sources. One of the things I think is interesting is you talked about putting a palette together, and natural dyes are really perfect for that. I wouldn't say that you can never put together natural colors that don't look good, because I've seen a couple if you try really hard, but mostly you put them together and they just sing.
You're right. They just naturally do. They all have like this quality where they soak into the fiber and the light vibrates off of them. And it's not this, there's a quality that the light bounces off of, like maybe a synthetic dye, and it's so bright. And your eye picks up on the fact that maybe that's not a natural occurrence. But on a natural dye, it just has a different reflective quality and it's deeper. And yeah, they all naturally go together. They magically go together. So I really love that about the natural dyes. And what I try to do is make an intense or saturated color, but make it kind of a neutral too, if that even makes sense. Because I feel like people are more excited about wearing something that's a neutral color. And I say that even though I make some bright pinks and I make some like this clay color in a bright yellow, but it's like a toned down version of it. Or it's like a bluish mustardy yellow, ochre. Like that's a lot of things a way to describe a yellow. But like an intense lemon yellow, people are probably not going to be as drawn to that to wear like in a full garment as they would with like more of an ochre color. And speaking of the natural history, the natural dye history, I'm reading this book called Colors. what's her name? Something Finley. I want to say Anne Finley. And every chapter is broken up into a different color. And then it just focuses on that color and how it came to be and all the places that you could find it in. And it's fascinating. It's like my evening read. I want to know more about the history, but wow, there's so much we've lost, Anne. Before 1956, when the synthetic dyes were discovered, because they were looking for cure for malaria, and that's
Hmm.
how I think red dyes were created.
Moving. I mean, some of them are really
Yeah.
quite old. I mean, about 100 years, but I suppose,
Before that, everything was naturally dyed, and I'm really fascinated by this idea of dyeing guilds. That was a whole industry
yeah.
everywhere, and there was certain ways that you made certain colors, and you did it by the way that the guild specified you do it. I remember running across the color black and how controversial that was. There was a specific way to make black, and it was to dye with indigo first to get a really strong base, and then over dye it with cochineal, which is will give you pinks and reds, and those two will give you a black-like appearance because there's enough pigment on the material that it would appear to be black. And then there was iron. You could do iron with logwood and over dye, things like that. But when everyone was primarily wearing wool, it would make the wool a bit brittle. So dye guilds just, it wasn't even allowed to touch iron to make black. The way that you made black was with the indigo and the cochineal. And the history of that is just so profoundly interesting to me. I know I want to know more. And I'm sure a bunch of your listeners know so much more about this than I do, because your listeners are very adept at this stuff. So if you know this, someone reach out to me and let's talk.
It's just indigo and cochineal together sounds like a really expensive way to get a
Oh,
color. Even currently, it would be a really expensive way to get a color.
yeah, I read that it was madder root, actually. Madder root or cochineal or kermes, Kermes, which is another insect that could create red. But yes, all of those things, those expensive materials laying over each other, that's a lot of dye material on a fiber to make that color. So that's why black was very expensive. It was a socioeconomic statement. If you were in a certain class, you could wear black. For a while, black was the mourning color, but then because it represents the absence of light, but then at some point in time it switched and white was the mourning, like the color of mourning, because it represented the beginning and end. So that's what's fascinating, is to find out that everyone in society agreed that this was the color that represented a thing, but then it changed and then it was an opposite color. So that stuff is really fascinating to learn.
Well, and pink is a boy color, pink is a girl color. There's that
Yeah.
sort of,
Oh, totally.
yeah.
And pink, I love pink, looks great on everybody. I love when men wear pink because it's such a great color, and to limit yourself because you're like, no, it'll say something about me I don't want it to say. So, yeah, it's still very symbolic in weird ways.
Speaking of historical color and when natural dyeing was the only dyeing, there was a piece in a book that we did called Nature's Colorways about this series of volumes of swatch books that someone essentially walked into a archive in London and said, these have been in my family. And they were 10 volumes with swatches and recipes and chemistry, and not only how you make these colors, but who you make them for, who these colors are for. Mr. X wants to reorder his pink, which we make doing this way. So I'll see if I can find a link to that story, because it's just once upon a time, this is what people were doing.
That's so cool. Yeah, it's complex. Color is complex. And I have started to do a color theory course that I've done a couple times, and it's kind of like the psychology of color
When you
and
say
how
you've done,
we
you've offered or you've taken.
I've offered.
Hmm.
Yeah. And exploring just in retail why certain colors sell or what people use and this is as an assortment. It's very psychological why we're drawn to certain things, but I also in history what certain colors mean. And it's still true today. Like on a branding standpoint, you notice like banks and financial institutions generally pick blue because that's supposed to feel very steadfast and very conservative and like you're in good hands. Whereas McDonald's is yellow and red because it makes you hungry and it's happy. So, on a brand standpoint, what you pick color wise is very important. But then what we pick personally to wear for ourselves is fascinating and it changes by region. Like dark green is really popular in the Northwest. I bet you in Key West, Florida, dark green is not as popular down there. It's every region, different countries have their color psychology going on too. So I love hearing about the history and the economic class, like the purples at first when purple was discovered, and you might know the history of this. It was a mollusk that was found off of the coast of Lebanon. And it was so secretive how this purple was created. And it took thousands and thousands of these mollusks to make just a few garments that the only people that could afford to wear them were kings and noblemen. And the process of getting the color out of that was smelly and difficult.
So much of it is smelly, really.
Really, yeah. And I read that like the way that they would produce it was they would do it on cliffs way out away from civilization so that the smell wouldn't waft into the city.
There's a related process done off the coast of Oaxaca that's still being done, purpura panza, where people go and they scale these cliffs and kind of like milk these little mollusks, which give this dye stuff, which has this very opalescent sort of like blue and green, and then it gets to purple. And so the purple colors that you find in a lot of garments from Oaxaca are from this snail color.
Yes, it's a different kind. So the one in the Middle East is completely different than the one in Middle America. And I think this one in particular that you're talking about, there's two ways to harvest it. One is to like pull it out of the snail, right, and get the pigment. And I've read that like if you push your finger on the muscle, you can kind of like force the pigment out, almost like burping it out of the snail so you don't
Yeah.
kill it. But I think in the process it like exhausts the poor little guy and it dies anyway.
Oh, I hadn't heard that part.
Yeah.
That's, oh dear. Oh, poor little guy.
I know. Sorry, but I mean
Oh,
like that's what I read. So
yeah. Oh, that's so speaking, not all of the colors have to be literally wrung out of a small beast, but part of what you're doing is also trying to make sure that whether it's because you have to have a huge amount of dye stuff and the stuff can be really expensive, you have to figure out how to be really efficient with your dye material, right? It's not like you can necessarily say, I'm just going to put in 2 teaspoons of this, but you also can't say, I'm just going to throw in a whole bucket.
yeah, very astute question. That is something that I've been working towards in my dye practice. So for a while, I would try to get a very specific, maybe like a light color, and I would use a dye extract because they're so consistent and they mix in the water really well and they give you color instantly. Gosh, I love working with those. And I would cold mordant for a week and get the fiber just prepared. And I would put a certain percentage of the dye material in the water and then put the yarn in. And then as the color reached its potential or what I was wanting to see, I would pull it out of the water. And sometimes I would find that it would only take a minute up to 5 minutes. And I'd be like, oh, the color is done. And I would take it out. And there would still be pigment in the water, but I would dump it because I didn't want to get a lighter batch. I was going for a consistent batch, right? So I'm now learning that I really need to work on those other dials that you have in natural dyeing, which is temperature and time. So it's temperature, time, and concentration. And when you use less material, you have to dial up the heat and the time, and vice versa. So now I'm learning how to be more efficient with the mordanting and really focus on the heat and use less material and then let the yarn sit and then have it soak up everything that it can. So you're not wasting any material, but you're still getting the right outcome. So it's just logistical. It's finding that right recipe and you tinker with it and work your way up to a bigger batch. So it's not very playful anymore, what I'm doing. I try to be very scientific and just getting the pots all the right temperature at the right time. When I can get 8 pots the right temperature, I'm like, yes. Oh, it could take like half a day just tinkering around and getting the temperature the same. So that's what it's so systematic at this point.
But that also means that, if you're really extracting everything and it's all getting into the yarn, it also means you don't have to waste as much time and water rinsing. The first time I did natural dyeing, it was somebody who really wanted us to have a good experience. And so she wound up dumping a huge amount of cochineal into this. And I was rinsing out cochineal and cochineal bugs for like a week,
Oh,
which probably there could have been a lot more. We weren't doing it to make a consistent yarn, so it wasn't an efficiency process. But when I think about, we probably could have gotten a lot more color out of that.
oh, absolutely. And cochineal, you can use whole cochineal and continue to boil and filter and boil and filter to extract all the color that you can, or you can grind it in a little coffee grinder, which I use now, and get specifically a certain color that way. The reason for reboiling it again and again is to maybe you want to do multiple dye baths, right? So you're getting all of that color. Whereas if you grind it and use it in one go, that's all you get. And at first I did the reboiling system, but now I grind it. But yes, it is really, I kind of had to let go of that feeling of, oh my gosh, I'm wasting color. Because in the beginning, I would try to do bath 2 and bath 3 and coax out every bit of color. And I would get successively lighter batches of yarn. But then I would find that certain colors were just really hard to recreate or they didn't sell well. And I was like, well, what is more wasteful? Making a whole bunch of color that people don't really want, or maybe dumping a little bit of something out that doesn't need to be reused. And I think that's one of those trade-offs when you get really into production dyeing. That's why I'm trying to get better at not wasting the material because I know I'm only going to use it once.
So when I think about these dye pots and getting them all up to the right temperature, and here it is in August, and I'm thinking, oh, going out to your garage, boiling some yarn. But what is Summer Emily excited about doing next? You've got all these fall things to prepare for.
Well, I'm still very much in the dyeing phase. That was, you painted a really good picture. There was a week of like a consistent 100-degree days all week, and I did not want to get off schedule. So I was out there dyeing in 100 degrees, and it was miserable. It was hot. I had a fan, had the doors open, right? But I gave myself a goal to reach to feel comfortable having enough product ready for those 3 events that I told you about. And I set a schedule and I'm adhering to that schedule. It really was trying to figure out what can I really accomplish if I put everything into this production? How much can one person seriously make in a certain amount of time? So I'm almost at the end of it. And then I get to go and teach a dye class and be at knit camp. And I get to travel to Bend. And then I get to do the Sacred Sheep event. And those are going to be so much fun. I really enjoy being at the events. I love talking to people. I love talking about the process. That is like the payoff for all of the hard work. Being around people. Yeah.
We didn't even talk about the part where you have all this great yarn and then you have to, I'm picturing you taking it into your dining room and you've designed these labels and now you have to put these stack of labels on this stack of yarn. And maybe 40 skeins a week to label is not as bad.
My dining room right now, I've got a few batches waiting to wind. I have 3 batches, so that's 120 skeins. And some of them are being broken down into half skeins. So there's a lot of after production that goes into getting those skeins looking really pretty. And then the labels, of course, and then getting it photographed, getting it on the website, all of that. It's an enormous task. And I just wish there was 2 of me. That would be really great. So I'm trying to figure out how much one person could do.
So it's not just all wandering around the garden like it looks like on your website?
I do make it look like that, don't I?
You do.
That is my favorite task of the day. In the summer, everything is blooming. All the flowers are blossoming. And that is like the most magical moment of my day, is standing out there and pulling the flowers off and drying them and watering the garden. I really like that part. But that's just a teeny tiny little part of the whole picture.
Well, it's a lovely picture. So
thank you. But, I think that's really what entices people. Like when they think of naturally dyeing, that's what they think of. And I want the process to look beautiful, even though some of it is me being very sweaty in my hot garage. And then the winding, all of the yarn dust that flies up into my eyes and my nose. Oh my gosh. Yeah, you wouldn't believe how much yarn dust there is after all that winding. That's kind of a weird part of the job.
That makes sense.
And it covers the whole surface. Sorry.
Thank you for letting me live the fantasy. So I appreciate that.
Yeah.
So, Emily, I would check on your website to find not only your yarn, but also where I can see you in the upcoming weeks and months.
Yes. So my website is full of all my yarn. I have natural dye kits. I actually don't have my upcoming events posted yet, but that's a great idea. I need to go and do that. If you sign up for my newsletter, I'm really active about telling you what's coming up there. And if you sign up to the newsletter, you will get a color theory freebie, a little download.
Oh, fun. Cool.
Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you so much. I am really grateful to you for taking some time out of your busy week. Hopefully you'll get to take a break before you go back to slaving over the dye pots.
Thank you. This was really fun. I really enjoyed talking with you. And I love all of your podcasts. So to be a part of this feels kind of like a dream.
Well, it's my pleasure. Thanks to our sponsors for supporting the podcast. Thank you for listening to the Long Thread Podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please rate the show and leave us a comment on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. Thanks again.